Hey guys, Diabor Disaster here, coming at you with a segment I like to call Improving Your Game. Now, the purpose of this segment is to give you just a handful of tips that will help you with your TCG experience with Digimon, and maybe just in general, your whole TCG experience as a whole. How to be better at playing a TCG, how to be better at deck building, stuff like that. So, we're going to start with deck building here. And just get right into it. The first thing I want to give out here is what I call CPRs, and that is consistency, protection, removal, and speed. Simply put, if your deck doesn't have any of these things, it's not going to win at least nearly as much. If we look, for example, at a deck like Beelzemon, it has 3 of these 4 things at high marks: consistency, speed, and removal. Which was why it was such a strong contender, especially before the Itmon hit. Decks that don't have these things tend to have a lot of trouble getting going, or their crackback isn't as strong after their board gets cleared. A few examples of things that do or do not do these things, I'm going to go ahead and go over here. Mind you, this is just based on their cores alone, no extra text or anything like that. Until after I've looked at their their evaluated stats and stuff. Just based on a quick evaluation on a 1 to 5 scale for these 4 items, Machine Dramon is a very good tier 1.5 deck. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that it can't beat the tier 1 decks. In fact, it's great into most of them. It's just because it's not nearly as represented by the players. And, outside of having some of the best protection in the game, as well as it being pretty good removal in the form of attacking unsuspended Digimon and deleting Tamers, but it's also relatively slow and somewhat consistent. It has an issue with bricking pretty badly early as well, and that's the only real reason it's not tier 1. This deck is quite strong on its own. I love playing it. Locals, it's very hard to play against. Another good example here is Bloom Lord. If you look here at its marks, it's really high. It doesn't have hardly any protection, but it's got consistency, removal, and speed. And just based on these stats alone, it is a tier 1 deck. It's super good. It doesn't really have any protection, like I said, outside of Cherrymon, but it does have tons of draw power in the form of the Kokomon eggs, Sunflowermon, and speed because of the naturally low Digivolution costs on all the level 4s it plays. It has a lot of search power in the form of Palmon, which, you go further into that, you can supplement with Green Memboost and stuff, but it plays a ton of Digimon. It Digivolves a lot, so you're going to see a lot of cards. Removal-wise, it has a high mark here because it has the ability to play Hydramon, which is just generic removal, and the longer it sticks around, the more they lose to it. In addition to having really high CPRs, it can lock down its own mirror match with Pomu and Terriermon, and it can play Quartzmon the most efficiently in the game, and sometimes the deck just OTKs you by turn 3 or 4. It's super fast. A deck that's not a good example of CPRs is Diaboromon. As much as I love Diaboromon, his deck lacks almost all these things, preventing it from being a strong contender at all. Sure, it's got, like, Decoy, it's got the first Diaboromon, which protects it from being deleted in battle. That's, like, all, though. Its Searcher isn't very good, because it doesn't search anything really worthwhile. The 2 Infomons that help speed the line building process up a little bit, they're not appropriately costed. The only thing this deck really has going for it is the Sec plus Diaboromon and Quartzmon. But there's decks that just play Quartzmon way more efficiently, and sometimes Diaboromon just dies in the security anyways, because he's not very big, and in order for him to be big, he has to have way too much setup already built up. By the point you've got like 3 Artas, you've made Diaboromon, you've got 3 tokens, you've got Caramon under it, making him still only like 14k. So like he still dies to every level 7 in the game from that point. So the deck's just not great. In addition to not having, good CPRs, it's just not a good commitment for a result. It's just butt, and I hate that. A good example of another good deck is Hunter. It's got great CPRs. It doesn't have like any protection, but because all of its stuff is extremely minimal resources, it just cracks back real easy. It's consistent naturally because it's a lot of low-level stuff, and lots of draw power in the form of like their whole purple line, the red Taiki, and 2 searching cards that they play 2 to 3 copies of each. One of the things Hunter doesn't have going for it typically, though, is resiliency when it comes to security stack. Like, the only thing your opponent worries about running to in the stack normally is Quartzmon, and that's it. You know, play like 1 to 2 copies. And it's very, very reliant on its tamers. Mind you, it can play off of like 2 sometimes, but like it needs them. So if Hunters just draws into all Digimon most of the time, they're in dire straits. They better sack into some tamers. It does, however, have the ability to push back, like I said, very easily, even after just losing all its Digimon. Because, you know, you can sometimes just, out of 2 memory, just play a dude, Digivolve for effectively 0 with your tamers, and then go up into Superior for 4, tuck a dude, and then swing twice. The deck can do so much for so little, and its removal is really high, having the most unique removal option in the game being Superior mode. Its speed is relatively fast. It's just as fast as Rookie Rush always was, and it's just really consistent. So naturally, it's got very good marks here, and it's just a very good deck. The last example I'm going to give here for the CPRs part of this discussion is Setcon. It's got very low marks on everything aside from removal. Mind you, removal is king, but it is very slow. It is very RNG. That's why I put its consistency so low. But with it being stuffed full with like 16 to 20 option cards that just remove stuff, Death X's, controlling tamers, you can consider calling this deck consistent just because of how stuffed full of the same thing it is, but it's just really hard to out constantly by decks when it just loses the security stack. It's like the only exception to the CPR's rule here. Another thing I would do with deck building is net deck. And now I know what you're thinking when I say that. I'm not saying to just pick a deck off the internet and be like, this is the best deck ever. No. You pick a deck, and then you play it as is, just to, you know, figure it out. And then you learn what cards are necessary, what cards are flex spots, and what cards can be other things. Because, you know, not everyone's list is going to be the most optimal. This isn't Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a game where you have a lot of room for, like, little things here and there. And you have room for techs that help you in certain matchups, because your deck is usually based on your local meta. So you're not going to be all like, oh, this deck that someone made is like the best version ever because it's the most recent one that won. Well, sure, it won because it was ready for a specific meta. Mind you, of course, they could just sack all their way there. It happens. But the reason why a lot of these decks are the way they are, and they win, because they were prepared for something. So a good example of this, I'm going to just use for an experience I did for myself. You guys might recall my Beelstar profile I made, I think, a couple months ago during BT12 post the ban list. My list didn't have access to Ruin Mode or the 4 copies of the EX2 Imp. So in their places, I decided to run the Gabumon from BT2 that allowed me to filter through my hand and get rid of options and draw into my late game. And I played Death X's in the place of Shine, so that way I'd have access to a card that was similar, but also I could recur them with Calling and Mat. And Analog Youth was in that list, and it's butt, because it doesn't even trigger Rivals Barrage. So I just maxed out the other 2 mill options and played draw and discard cards instead. Plus Rivals Barrage is the only real way to out Quartzmon, so... but you see what I mean. There were cards that I found that I didn't like in the deck because they weren't, like, optimal. They became flex spots, and now the deck that I built has been almost undefeated. It's been winning in tournaments. It's very good to test against. So this is just a prime example of why not to just, like, you know, stick to a list you found online. Start with a list you found online, and then build it from there. Trust me, you're going to thank me for that later. And the last thing on deck building here, I would say, well, I guess two things would be to have a WinCon, or at least know your path to victory, and leave room for text and generic cards. Now, the WinCon and path to victory. Some decks just have a very obvious win button. So, like, in my Machine Digimon list, it has a Ragnalord from the starter deck, which is just a giant freaking win button against anything that's slow enough to just lose to it. Now, some decks don't have, like, an obvious, like, win button, but they have cards that just help them secure games. Like Hunter has superior modes, which do a lot of their heavy lifting, especially in the games where they're behind. But they can also just do all their damage by digicrossing one by one, get a couple of extra damage in here and there. Now, the other thing is leaving room for text and generic cards, and just literally that. Your deck typically has flex spots outside of the normal core. And not all decks are good in every matchup, so you might want to use those like slots to make those bad matchups better. Obviously, like, you wouldn't want to do that for something you're never gonna see. But here's some good examples. Like, let's say we're playing a purple deck that has recurring availability to it. So Gazimon and Psychmon are good there. Death X is good against going wide decks. So if your deck struggles against that, maybe put in 2 Death X so you can supplement your deck against those matchups. Cocytus Breath and Megadeth are good against singleton stacks that have evade. So let's say you're playing against Old Force or Big Dragon, Examon. Those 2 cards remove Examon without a problem. So, like, you could tech those in your deck if you have a problem against those decks. Like, Beelzemon was horrible into Examon. So, like, you could play a 2/2 line of the red-blue Tamer and Cocytus Breath if you wanted a easy out to that matchup, if you're worried someone in your locals is going to be playing it. Generic removal in a deck that doesn't normally have it. A pretty good example of this would just be Rookie Rush, or something like Rookie Rush that doesn't normally play any real thick removal. You could, like, slightly alter your colors to play Ultimate Flare. You could play Death X. You could play Schwartz. Just don't be afraid to fit in generic removal. It's not always bad to have. There are some decks that just don't have room for it and would rather have consistency added to it. Like, let's say in Jessamon, I'd rather, you know, fit in consistency cards in my, like, 4 flex spots, as opposed to adding removal options that might come up and might just brick. The next part of the segment, I'm going to go off briefly here, is memory management. By this, I just mean not blowing through your resources and overextending. A perfect example of this is, let's say you have 3 memory, and you have the ability, if you wanted to play a 3-cost card, and then you want to play a memory tamer right after that. You could do that, but doing that is going to set your opponent to 4 memory, and that's a lot. Whereas you could just play the memory tamer, setting them to 1, and then they're like, oh, I can only play with 1 memory this turn. So you force them to basically hand you your memory back, and then you continue. So you don't necessarily have to, like, just slap down all your cards because you can. It's good to pace it out like that so you're not giving them a lot to play with. Another thing to go off of here, which, by the way, we're still on memory management, but that is playing between tamers, quote unquote. This is a phrase I use when both players have memory tamers up. You're playing in between where both players have 3. So effectively, give yourself a 6 memory budget to play on. Knowing that allows you to purposely and just more efficiently budget your hand out. I'd say promoting or holding off on promoting too early is definitely something to learn. Some decks require a pretty precise setup when moving out from their breathing area. So you want to understand the board state before you commit the line. You need to understand what your opponent's deck is capable of, and if they can remove your guy when you promote it. Some matchups, like let's say Black Wargrave versus Seccon, you typically won't move your line out until you can turn it into Metal Gray X or Black Wargrey X, so that way your Yu-Gi-Oh will trigger and keep you safe from option cards. Jessmon, you don't typically commit the Savior Hawk until you can make the Jessmon and do your like 5 Sistermon play. Hunter versus Ruin mode, you typically want to set up a guy in your raising area that has Dracmon and is level 4. So that way when they Ruin mode, you can just promote it out and turn it into a Restridgemon, and it's immune to the 5k reduction because it is 6k during your turn. Here's one thing that I had to beat into a lot of newbie players, and that is expect the worst to happen. And this mostly applies to when you're just attacking security. Expect the attacking Digimon, in most cases, to die to security, unless you know it absolutely can't. Here's some examples, though. Let's say I'm attacking a Digimon, my opponent's stack with an 11k Digimon, which means it can die to anything level 6 or above, for the most part. So in this case, it's not going to survive probably a security battle if you're, banking on it living. So swing with it knowing it's probably going to die. So think about that. If you can think about, like, is it worth doing this now? And leaving my board potentially open, or should I hold off on it and wait until the board is more ready for this play? Let's say you attack your opponent's security with a jamming Digimon or something with 18 or higher DP. At that point, it's going to live all security battles without modifiers, because the highest DP in the game is 17k. So you can expect it to, in most cases, survive the security checks. Outside of obvious random option cards. And then when attacking into an option-heavy deck's security stack, just expect your guy to die to security. And if it doesn't, cool. You kept a dude. Like, honestly, that is a mentality on how to be very good at this game. Because, like, if you're expecting your Digimon to die based on your play, and it sticks, you're very heavily rewarded for it. And then another big thing is exploiting shortcomings. And it's a really sucky thing to say when you're trying to play a nice casual game, but when you're trying to win, all bets out. And it's a necessary evil, unfortunately, here. A few examples of this are just like removing their stack after they've whiffed to fully promote it up to its like prime, keeping the opponent's board empty when they brick, so that way they just don't have much to show for it, and you're just poking in for as much damage as you can. And then attacking your opponent's Digimon is usually more important than attacking their security. At least while you're attacking their Digimon, you're removing the work they spent to put them up and putting them behind in card economy here. Another good thing to do is to just play everything. Even if you have no intention of owning every deck, pilot decks other players play, even if it just means like borrowing your friend's deck, ruffle through it, maybe play a quick solitaire game or two, just so you can understand it a little bit. That way you can understand choke points, you can understand what the deck's resources are, and what it will have or won't have access to when you play against it. And at the same time, make sure that you at least briefly review the cards in each set. At least like the option cards and the SRs and above. At least that way you'll be prepared when you play against the decks that have those cards, especially like rogue matchups. Like, I had no idea what Ravemon did, but I actually like read about it and learned about it with one of my buddies who was testing it against my other buddy. I'm like, oh, this deck's actually cool. But I learned some of the tricks it had access to, so you got to be mindful of those things. And then lastly, I would say it's kind of in the same boat, is be willing to proxy and test for future mechanics and cards. Getting used to those things well before they're available to you will give you a huge leg up when you're playing in your first locals for that tournament. This is going to be relatively relevant for the BT 13-14 gap. Obviously, we're going to have the ace cards before them, or at least the first two. But doing this makes it to where you will be very well versed in how those mechanics work and how those cards work before they come out here, where some players aren't even touching those things before they come out. you'll be well versed in those things and be able to play optimally against players making, you know, amateur mistakes that you would have made if you didn't do this. This is how a lot of successful players play games that especially come out in Japan. Yu-Gi-Oh!, Vanguard, Pokemon even now, because now that lists are becoming even more available through like Twitter and such. These things make it to where players are so much more like in the loop when cards come out, and it's why those players are typically the ones at the winners tables early on. It's not just because they got those cards, it's because they are very well versed in how their deck works when the cards are so new to your area. Sure, you can kind of think of it as like cheat codes, but like it's a legitimate thing. Like me and my buddies used to do this for Vanguard a lot, and because of this, we were testing a deck for like 3 or 4 months before it even came out in America. Then we had it. We just blew through competition for months because we just knew how the deck worked so much like sooner than other players. And sometimes, you know, players aren't also able to get cards as soon as that. So like when a deck becomes like expensive or stays expensive after release, and players don't have it, so they aren't like testing with the deck. So like, you see what I mean here? Like, because you're able to test with the deck with proxies before the cards came out, you're going to know that the deck is good before it even reaches the States. And then when it hits the States, you know exactly how many copies you need of everything. Obviously, you need to spend the money, but you're going to know what your deck is capable of the moment it comes out, bare bone, all the way down. Whereas not everyone's going to do that. And mind you, this is something I feel like most players should do if they can, but it's going to give you a huge leg up because not everyone's going to do it. But anyways, that's it for my segment on improving your Digimon TCG experience, or I guess in general your TCG experience as a whole, because these things can be very much applied to every other game, just ever so slightly changed. There's a lot of small nuances here and there that you'll learn along the way from becoming an amateur player to a much better player, but these key points should help, and I hope you enjoyed this very lengthy video. And please let me know what you thought down in the comments section. If you enjoyed that video and want to see more, feel free to click on the most recent video link on the left side of the video, or just go to my channel link and check out all the awesome Digimon content I have for you there. While you're there, smash the subscribe button for me so we can keep the channel going. Also, more content on my TikTok about Digimon news, card releases, and just general rants about the card game, and the occasional random video. Don't forget to answer the question of the week at the bottom of this video down in the comment section, and as always, have a diabolical day.